Rubbish in, rubbish out, with ex-Google engineer Fili from the Search Brothers. Brought to you by Majestic, I'm David Bain, and this is SEO in 2022. Fili, what is your number one SEO tip for 2022?
Well, most definitely, you want to make sure that you kind of control what goes into the algorithms of search engines. So if you look at search engines, Google, Bing, others, we as webmasters are responsible for what goes into the algorithms. We have a website. We need to make sure that our website is crawlable, indexable, and that search engines understand our content. Now, a lot of the algorithms are like a black box. We don't have control as SEOs, as webmasters, website owners. We don't have control over the programming of how those algorithms are programmed, are executed, how they're run, and what comes out of it, the search results that we all would like to be ranking high in. However, as a webmaster, we do have control over what goes into those algorithms. So we want to make sure that what we send into the algorithms is the right thing. And if we want to change how we come out of those algorithms, that black box of algorithms that Google and other search engines are continuously tweaking, we need to make sure that what we send in changes. So if we want to change the output, we need to change the input. If not, if we're sending in rubbish, we're going to get rubbish out. And that's basically what we're talking about today. So we want to make sure if we want to improve our rankings, we do need to focus on what we send into those algorithms.
So what are examples of rubbish that SEOs typically send in to the algorithms?
Good question. So some of these things that we see often, or I see often being sent into the algorithms, is problems with trust signals like canonization that is done wrong, or sitemaps that basically are sending the wrong signal by having non-indexable patterns in them, or very simple, very low content pages or lean content pages, pages with barely any content, or and that are indexable, obviously, and are being considered as a search result. At least that's what the webmaster is saying to the search engine like Google. Please index this particular page, but the page doesn't have any unique sales proposition, doesn't have a value, shouldn't actually rank in the first place. And if we have too many of these, we're basically sending into the algorithms a lot of rubbish. So software force is another one that where we need to be careful. What signals are we sending into the algorithms? Can Google actually trust our server codes? Can Google trust the content that we're sending?
Great. Okay, so I'd probably describe that then as the degree of confidence that Google has in what you do, and then the willingness its willingness to rank you for contextual terms because it's not particularly confident in what you do. Is that a reasonable way of describing it?
In a way, yes. It's really about, well, you have heard in the industry probably terms being tossed around as content quality, EAT, authority, domain
Sure.
authority, all these type of things, both from an on-page as well as from an off-page perspective. And it's true that a lot of these signals, they matter. We do need to make sure some of them are signals, some of them just methodology of evaluating content like EAT. That's not an actual ranking signal, but it's a way of evaluating the quality of our content and to see, do we stand out enough? Do we have enough authority in a way that the user would say to Google, hey, this is a very good website. Now, user signals is another way that Google is generating based on the search results to see if you should be ranking. So yeah, the overall trend of the signals that we're sending into algorithms determines the trust level and the authority that we have, and if we should rank for certain terms or not.
Great. Okay. So you mentioned a few different elements there that SEOs can alter in order to improve the quality of what they're feeding into algorithms. Things like sitemaps, poor content, user signals. It would be great to dive into them individually, maybe a little bit more, just to give a couple of specific tips in terms of what SEOs can do to improve them. So maybe sitemaps to begin with. What are specific aspects of sitemaps that SEOs are getting wrong at the moment?
Well, it really depends. It's not just SEOs; it's primarily also webmasters. And just to highlight a quick thing before I go into the sitemap part, you have to keep in mind that a lot of recommendations that Google gives publicly through their different channels is aimed at the average webmaster. The majority of website owners and webmasters actually are not active in SEO or very minimal active in SEO. This is where the algorithms do a lot of automatic stuff. Now, what webmasters often get wrong is they generate one sitemap and they have a dynamic website and they don't generate a new sitemap when they have new content. So you get content that is basically indexable, that is discoverable in your website, but you don't have it in your sitemap. Another common mistake I see is having non-indexable patterns in the sitemap. Patterns that we don't want to have in the sitemap are in the sitemap, and they have, for example, a meta no index, or they're redirecting, or they're 404, they're deleted, something like that. Another example with sitemaps that I see often as well is that people are pursuing news, and they have a news sitemap, and they're trying to rank in news and discover and stuff like that. But the problem is that you need to make sure that your sitemap is correct. Like, there are different rules for new sitemaps than there are for normal XML sitemaps. Like, you should only have an entry there for the last 2 days and only 1,000 articles in the sitemap. If you have it longer than 2 days, it's not compliant with the guidelines for new sitemaps.
How important are sitemaps in the grand scheme of things? So, for instance, if you have a website that is brilliant, is just a wonderful user experience, has great content on it, and is delivering to search engines in terms of content and uniqueness, something a lot better than the competition, but you've got a terrible sitemap, is that likely to impact your ranking significantly?
Well, I'm going to narrow the field there a little bit to XML sitemaps, because HTML sitemaps is a completely different topic, and I'm happy to talk about that too. But when it comes to XML sitemaps, it doesn't. The XML sitemap is a signal for Google, like, hey, here are all the canonicals of all the indexable URLs that we would like to have indexed and be considered as a SEO landing page. Something that you can use in the search results for actual users, and when the user lands on that, there's going to be value to the user. That's the idea of a sitemap, just to have a list available. But it's not just the list alone that gets you crawled. Google also wants to see, are there any internal linking to it? Then on top of that, are there any canonization to it? So there's multiple different signals that Google uses to prioritize which URLs Google crawls. Sitemap is just one of them, but not the only one.
Understood. Great. And you also mentioned poor content. So what would you describe as poor content nowadays? Is it thin content? Is it many pages on your site without having much content? Is it pages on your site having duplicate content, the same content as other web pages out there, or some other definition?
So what we're talking about here is primarily having content that users are actually interested in. You kind of need to solve the problem for the users. And if you're not solving that problem, then it's content mostly for SEO purposes. We see that a lot in e-commerce, for example, where you have on top of a category page, where you have a couple of articles in the category page, you have a small 2-3 lines and then a read more, and under that read more there's another, say, 500 words of text hidden. That's not there for users, that's there for search engines. And this is not a good approach for users. The content isn't attractive to users, and it's not really carrying much weight either, because it's also hidden. It's Google can see this is written for SEO. It's not great content. So when we're talking about lean content, it doesn't necessarily mean, or poor quality content, it doesn't necessarily mean lack of content, although that could be one of the reasons as well.
Okay, great. And the last element that I'd like to touch upon that you mentioned is user signals. So what constitutes important user signals that search engines pick up on?
Yeah, good question. So one of the key things to keep in mind is when a user starts a search on a search engine like Google, they are Google's user. They're not your user. They're not anywhere near being your user at this point. They're Google user. And Google wants to satisfy the need of their users, not your users, their users. So a user will type in a query and will see a bunch of search results, say, just for the hypothetical case, the standard 10 search results, and clicks on the first one. Now, if the page loads very slowly, or the content is very poor, or we are running into a 404 error or 500 error, like the server can't handle the load, all of these type of things, then the searcher is likely to go back. Also, if the expectations have not been managed, keep in mind that our search result, often based on a meta description and page title, needs to manage the user expectation. We need to make sure that our meta tags and page titles are optimized, that it contains what is the benefit of clicking on this search result versus the other 9. Why this search result is going to give them the answer, and what to expect when they do click on it. What is the unique sales proposition? Now, once they click on it and we don't deliver on that in any way, the user may go back. At this point, it's still a Google user. It's not your user. It's a Google. They may navigate your website 5 pages, but or even 10, or stop and then the next day type in the same query again, and then go at Google and then go back not to your website, but to the next one, number 2 result. All of these situations where the user goes back to Google straight away or later, and the user indicates this search result did not satisfy me in one way or another, for whatever reason, and again, there can be plenty of reasons why, then basically the user clicks on the next search result. The user just communicated your search result isn't great. Now, the key thing, and this comes in the overall topic, also with rubbish in, rubbish out, it's all about trends. Now, I know there's a lot of people who are focused in the SEO world on specific numbers, like what's the percentage? How much of my site do I have to recrawl in order to get XYZ counted and stuff like that? It's not about specific numbers. These numbers change all the time and often are based as a snapshot of what Google has crawled at that given moment of the entire web. Now, the web is continuously changing with removing, editing, and adding new content on a daily basis on a whole bunch of URLs. Google is crawling a big chunk of that on a daily basis, and it needs to process that. And any moment in time that we perform a search, that is also a search on the snapshot of the database, the index at that moment. That index changes just a few seconds later, or faster even. So we're very focused on specific numbers where we should be more focused on the overall trends. What are we sending as a trend into the algorithms? And also from an off-page perspective, off-page being very important as well as a factor, not necessarily for page rank purposes, but also for discovery purposes, to prioritize which URLs should Google crawl next.
Great thoughts there. Now, I'm sure that you can speak in a great deal of depth about Google's algorithms and what you can do to try and enhance your rankings, your traffic that you drive from organic Google search. But I'm sure you also speak to many marketers who aren't technical marketers. So how do you go about explaining algorithms to marketers that aren't that technical?
Well, to be honest, it's pretty simple in a way. We're talking about formulas. So when you have a formula, most people have had calculus or something like that at high school or even at primary school. And you can see if you change the number in the sum, then you're going to get a different output. Now, in a very basic way, to explain how you could also see algorithms, is, for example, a navigation system in your car. So if you have a car with a navigation system and you're on the road and you're going to a certain destination and the navigation system is telling you where to go to and which turn to take, but you're not paying attention, you're missing that turn. Yeah. It's not like at that point your tires are getting slashed. You can't move any further. It just means it takes longer to get there. Yeah, and this is kind of what happens with algorithms. Algorithms are basically calculating in the backend to see where you should be placed. They do continuous testing, and they're trying to figure out, the algorithms most of the time, trying to figure out what is the best result for the user, their user. Now, once the user converts on our website into an actual, say, buyer or something, then they become our user. But until that time, they're a Google user.
Great advice. So if an SEO is listening to you and thinking, you're right, my site is probably sending a lot of rubbish into the algorithms. I'm doing okay, but I could probably have many quick wins if I focus on the quality of the signals that I'm providing to search engines. So, what's one thing that type of SEO needs to stop doing in order to spend more time doing what you suggest?
Well, I'm actually going to give you two things. For one, we need to make sure that we check what we're sending in. So people do need to do some audits of their website. They can do it themselves. They can go to third parties, but they do need to check what goes in. They can use a whole bunch of tools out there in the industry. I would say go and discover, but check what are you actually sending in. And not just from an on-page perspective, also from an off-page perspective. Off-page, that's the other thing. I would most definitely say what you need to stop doing is buy links for the sake of PageRank. That just doesn't work. It's not beneficial in most cases. If you're spending, for example, a certain amount of money every month to get like 20 links pointed to your website, you're spending your money, you're throwing your money literally in the garbage bin. It's not working. What you should be spending that budget on is getting converting traffic. So if you build links, make sure you build links that convert traffic on your website.
Wonderful. You can find Fili over at SEO.services. Fili, thanks so much for being part of SEO in 2022.
Thank you very much.
Check out the rest of the content from SEO in 2022 over at SEOin2022.com.